Imagine being part of an army that had never truly been stopped. An army that moved across Europe like a storm. Cities fell in days. Entire countries collapsed in weeks. Tanks rolled forward. Planes dominated the skies. And soldiers believed victory was almost guaranteed wherever they went. This was the power of the German blitzkrieg in the early years of World War II. But in the winter of 1941, something happened that shocked the world. Near the city of Moscow, that unstoppable war machine began to slow, and then it began to break. Snow covered the battlefield, temperatures dropped to brutal levels, and the Red Army launched a fight that would become one of the most important turning points of the entire war. Here on History Plus, we explore the moments in history that changed the world, and today we are stepping into one of the most dramatic battles ever fought on the Eastern Front. Before we continue, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to History Plus if you enjoy powerful history stories like this. Your support helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing fascinating moments from the past to life. To understand what happened near Moscow in 1941, we need to go back to the summer of that year. In June, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The goal was clear: destroy the Soviet Union quickly before it could fully organize its defenses. At first, the plan seemed to work exactly as Hitler expected. German forces moved forward using their famous blitzkrieg tactics. Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, relied on speed, surprise, and coordination between tanks, aircraft, and infantry. Instead of slow battles, the German army tried to break enemy lines quickly and surround entire armies before they could escape. During the early months of the invasion, this strategy caused devastating losses for the Soviet Union. Huge numbers of Soviet troops were surrounded and captured. Entire armies disappeared in massive encirclement battles. German tanks moved deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, sometimes advancing hundreds of miles in only a few weeks. For many German soldiers, it seemed like victory was inevitable. Reports of massive Soviet losses spread across Europe, and many people believed the Soviet Union would collapse before the end of the year. German commanders expected to capture the most important Soviet cities and force a surrender long before winter arrived. But the Soviet Union was far larger and more resilient than many German leaders had predicted. Even after suffering enormous losses, the Red Army continued to fight. New soldiers were mobilized across the country, and factories began producing huge numbers of weapons and vehicles. Meanwhile, the distances on the Eastern Front continued growing larger. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, their supply lines stretched further and further behind them. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts all had to travel enormous distances to reach the front lines. This created serious problems for the German army. Roads were often poor, railways had to be repaired constantly, and many trucks and vehicles were already worn down after months of non-stop movement. Every mile the army advanced made the supply situation more difficult. Despite these challenges, the German High Command focused on one major objective for the final phase of the campaign in 1941: the capture of Moscow. The Soviet capital was not only a political center but also a major hub for railways and communications. Many German leaders believed that if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union might collapse entirely. So the German army launched a massive offensive toward the city. Tanks, artillery, and infantry moved forward with the goal of reaching Moscow before winter arrived. Early victories gave them confidence that the plan might succeed. But while German forces pushed closer to Moscow, something else was approaching from the north and east, something that had shaped wars in Russia for centuries: winter. Itai. First the signs were subtle. The temperature began to drop, and the ground became harder under the boots of soldiers and the tracks of tanks. Then autumn rains arrived, turning roads into deep mud. Vehicles struggled to move, and supply trucks often became stuck for hours, or even days. This muddy season, known in Russia as Rasputitsa, slowed the German advance significantly. Tanks that once raced across open fields now struggled to move through thick mud. The famous speed of blitzkrieg began to fade. But the mud was only the beginning, because soon the temperature would drop even further. The ground would freeze solid. Snow would cover the battlefield. And near the gates of Moscow, the Red Army was preparing to turn the winter itself into a weapon. As the German army pushed closer to Moscow in the autumn of 1941, the pressure on both sides grew stronger with every passing week. For the German soldiers on the front lines, the capital of the Soviet Union felt almost within reach. Reconnaissance units reported that some forward elements were now only a short distance from the city. The belief that Moscow could fall before winter gave many commanders renewed determination to keep advancing. But the situation on the ground was becoming more complicated than the maps in German headquarters suggested. Months of intense fighting had exhausted many German units. Tanks that had traveled hundreds of miles were breaking down more often. Vehicles needed repairs and spare parts were not always available. Many soldiers had been fighting almost non-stop since the summer invasion began. The deeper the German army moved into Soviet territory, the longer their supply lines became. Fuel trucks had to travel enormous distances over damaged roads just to reach the front lines. Ammunition and food supplies sometimes arrived late, forcing soldiers to conserve what little they had. What had once been a fast and efficient war machine was slowly starting to feel the strain of distance and time. At the same time, the Soviet Union was reorganizing its defenses around Moscow. The city became the center of a massive effort to stop the German advance. Soldiers, engineers, and even civilians worked together to build defensive positions. Trenches were dug across the countryside, anti-tank barriers were placed along key roads, and artillery units were positioned to defend important routes leading toward the capital. For the people of Moscow, the danger was very real. German forces were approaching from multiple directions, and many feared that the city could soon become the next major battlefield of the war. Despite the fear, the Soviet government encouraged the population to continue supporting the defense effort. Factories increased production, workers built fortifications, and new soldiers were sent to reinforce the Red Army. But perhaps the most important development happening at this time was taking place far away from Moscow, thousands of miles to the east. Soviet intelligence had discovered that Japan was unlikely to attack the Soviet Union from Siberia. This information allowed Soviet leaders to make a crucial decision. They began moving experienced divisions from Siberia to the Western Front. These soldiers were not ordinary reinforcements. Many of them were trained to fight in extreme winter conditions. They were used to harsh cold, deep snow, and long battles in frozen landscapes. Their equipment reflected this experience. They wore thick winter uniforms, warm boots, and gloves, designed for freezing temperatures. When these Siberian units began arriving near Moscow, they brought something the Red Army desperately needed: fresh strength and renewed confidence. Meanwhile, conditions for the German army were becoming increasingly difficult. The cold was growing more intense with each passing day. Frost appeared on weapons and vehicles in the early mornings. Soldiers began to realize that their clothing was not designed for the brutal winter they were about to face. Many of them still wore uniforms meant for autumn weather. Heavy winter coats and proper cold weather boots were in short supply. German planners had expected the campaign to end before winter began, and because of that assumption, large amounts of winter equipment had never been delivered to the front lines. As November moved toward December, the temperature continued dropping. Engines became harder to start in the morning cold. Oil thickened inside vehicle engines, making tanks and trucks less reliable. Weapons sometimes jammed when exposed to freezing conditions for too long. The soldiers themselves also suffered. Long nights spent in freezing temperatures drained their strength and morale. Frostbite began affecting many men who had little protection against the cold. But while the German army struggled against both the Soviet defenders and the approaching winter, the Red Army was preparing for something far more aggressive. The Soviet leadership knew that the German advance had slowed. They could see the exhaustion in the enemy lines and the logistical problems growing behind the German front. For months, the Red Army had been forced to retreat. But now the situation was changing. Fresh Siberian troops were arriving. Winter conditions were becoming harsher for the Germans, and the Red Army was preparing for the moment when it would finally strike back. Near the frozen approaches to Moscow, one of the most important counterattacks of the entire war was about to begin. By the beginning of December 1941, the battlefield around Moscow had transformed into a frozen landscape. Thick snow covered the forests, villages, and open fields stretching across the front lines. Temperatures dropped to levels that many German soldiers had never experienced before. In some places, the cold reached nearly -40 degrees. Under these brutal conditions, both armies prepared for what would become one of the most important moments of the entire war. For the German army, the freezing weather created constant problems. Tanks and trucks often refused to start in the morning. Soldiers sometimes had to light small fires beneath engines just to warm them enough to function. Metal weapons became painfully cold to touch, and rifle mechanisms could freeze if not cleaned. Constantly, the cold affected the soldiers just as badly as the machines. Many German troops were still wearing uniforms designed for autumn rather than deep winter. Gloves, heavy coats, and proper boots were limited in many units. Long nights, spent in freezing temperatures, drained the strength of even experienced soldiers. Frostbite became common, and some troops were no longer able to fight effectively. Despite these conditions, German commanders still hoped to push forward and capture Moscow. Orders continued encouraging units to advance whenever possible, but every mile now required enormous effort, and the famous speed of blitzkrieg had almost completely disappeared. Meanwhile, the Red Army was preparing something that would change the entire situation on the battlefield. Fresh Siberian divisions had now arrived in large numbers around Moscow. These soldiers were trained to fight in extreme winter environments. They wore white camouflage uniforms that blended perfectly with the snowy landscape. Many of them were equipped with skis, allowing them to move quickly across forests and frozen terrain where vehicles struggled to travel. While German units were slowing down because of the weather, Soviet forces were becoming more mobile and confident. Then, on December 5, 1941, the moment finally arrived. The Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire front surrounding Moscow. The attack began with powerful artillery barrages that shook the frozen ground beneath German defensive positions. Soon after, waves of Soviet infantry began moving forward through the deep snow. Siberian ski troops advanced rapidly across forests and frozen fields, appearing suddenly from unexpected directions. Tanks pushed through the snow behind them while fresh infantry units followed closely. After months of defending and retreating, the Red Army was now pushing forward with determination. For many German soldiers, the sudden intensity of the Soviet attack came as a shock. They had expected the Red Army to remain on the defensive, weakened after months of heavy losses. Instead, they were facing fresh troops who were well prepared for winter combat. Fighting erupted across the frozen countryside outside Moscow. Villages changed hands as both sides struggled for control. Soviet troops launched repeated attacks, forcing German units to defend positions under freezing conditions and constant pressure. As the attacks continued, some German commanders realized that their positions were becoming increasingly dangerous. The risk of being surrounded by advancing Soviet forces grew larger every day. Reluctantly, orders began to appear allowing certain units to withdraw to safer positions. What had once been a powerful advance toward Moscow was now turning into a difficult and dangerous retreat. For the first time since the invasion of the Soviet Union began, the German army was being pushed backward on a large scale. The frozen fields around Moscow had become the place where the unstoppable momentum of Nazi Germany finally began to break. As the Soviet counteroffensive continued through December 1941, the battlefield outside Moscow became a place of constant movement and brutal fighting. German units that had once pushed forward with confidence were now struggling just to hold their positions. The cold remained relentless, and every day seemed to bring new attacks from the advancing Red Army. For the German soldiers on the front lines, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Supplies were still limited, and the freezing temperatures made even simple tasks exhausting. Vehicles often failed in the cold, and many soldiers were forced to spend long nights in the snow with little protection from the freezing wind. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued gaining strength and confidence. The arrival of fresh Siberian divisions had changed the balance of the battlefield. These troops were trained for winter warfare, and they used the snow-covered terrain to their advantage. Moving quickly across forests and frozen fields, they launched attack after attack against German positions. The Soviet offensive slowly pushed German forces farther away from Moscow. What had once been a powerful German drive toward the capital was now turning into a defensive struggle. German commanders realized that continuing to push forward was no longer possible. Their priority had shifted from capturing Moscow to simply stabilizing the front. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began, the German war machine had been forced into a major retreat. The idea that Nazi Germany could defeat the Soviet Union quickly had completely disappeared. Instead, the war on the Eastern Front was becoming a long and brutal struggle that would last for years. The defense of Moscow became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance during World War II. For the Soviet Union, it proved that the German army could be stopped. News of the successful defense spread across the country, strengthening the determination of soldiers and civilians alike. Factories continued producing tanks, artillery, and weapons in huge numbers. New soldiers joined the Red Army, and the Soviet leadership prepared for the long war that now lay ahead. The events of the winter of 1941 had completely changed the direction of the conflict. Historians today often describe the Battle of Moscow as one of the first major turning points of the entire war. It was the moment when the unstoppable momentum of German blitzkrieg finally broke. The invasion that Hitler believed would end in a quick victory had instead become a dangerous and exhausting war of attrition. The snow-covered battlefields outside Moscow showed the world something important. Even the most powerful military machine could be stopped by determination, resilience, and the harsh realities of nature. Here on History Plus, we explore these incredible moments where history changes direction. Stories like this remind us that the outcome of wars is not always decided by power alone. Sometimes courage, endurance, and the will to continue fighting can change everything. If you found this story interesting, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the German army could have captured Moscow if the winter of 1941 had not been so brutal? Your opinion matters, and the discussion makes this community even stronger. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it with friends who are interested in World War II history. Your support helps History Plus continue bringing powerful historical stories to life. Because sometimes a single battle, a single winter, and the determination of millions of people can change the course of history forever.